Hello students, my name is Julian Kearns. I'm your instructor in this Principles of Economics course. This is a picture of me on a glacier with the chopper that brought me there. I'm showing you this because it's really cool and also because my front-facing camera doesn't work. I am in fact a real person. This course, however, is not about me. It is about economics. So let's get to that, shall we? Now, economics is the study of resource allocation. Here's another definition for what economics studies. But a reasonable place to start might be to think about, first of all, what the economy is. All right, look, here's the deal. We are human beings, which is why economics is a social science, and we are stuck here on planet Earth with limited resources. Um, Humans want lots of stuff. We seem to have basically unlimited wants, actually. And the fact that we are stuck here with unlimited wants, as a group anyway, um, with only limited resources, is a situation called scarcity. And this is what motivates the study of economics. If we didn't have scarcity, we wouldn't need to study how to use the resources we have. But the reality is that we are stuck here on planet Earth, and we do seem to have basically unlimited wants. And so we need to study how to use the resources we have in order to fulfill as many of those wants as possible. Now, human beings don't typically want things exactly as nature provides them, right? We don't want the natural resources that exist in the world by and large. We want goods and services that are produced with those resources. And friends, that's what the economy does. It converts the resources that we have into the goods and services that people want and then distributes those goods and services. Right? That is the fundamental job of the economy. All right. So economics is, here's an alternate definition, right? The study of the choices people make to attain their goals given their scarce resources. And this idea about allocating resources and figuring out how to make choices to attain goals based on those scarce resources. This is a complex set of tools, one that can be applied very widely. We all make economic decisions because of scarcity every day. Every day we have only a certain amount of time and only a certain amount of money, and we have to decide what to do with that time and money. Those are all economic choices, right? The CEOs of big businesses, their whole job is to allocate the resources of the firm in a way that maximizes the profits of the firm. The president of the college where you're taking this course, that person's whole job is to allocate the resources of the college in a way that creates an environment where students can be as successful as possible. This issue of resource allocation is critical, and in this class we're going to get some tools for how to deal with it. Now, one of the approaches that economists use in studying resource allocation is to create what are called models. Now, a model is just a simplified version of the world, and it helps us try to understand some specific things about the world. And we'll talk a lot more about models as they come up in this class. Now, because we can apply these concepts of economics and resource allocation so widely, it's helpful to start with some fundamental ideas that we will keep coming back to because we are going to employ these ideas widely. But here are the sort of three fundamental ideas we'll keep coming back to. All right, one, people are rational. Now, I must tell you that the first time I took this class, this was the first thing that was brought up in terms of the actual course material, and I objected immediately. It was not an auspicious beginning for someone starting a career in economics, but I want to assure you that you can have a career in economics if you immediately rejected that idea, right? The people are rational, okay? So probably the key to understanding, whether or not that's a reasonable statement, people are rational, is to be analytical. And this is something I want to encourage you to do. You probably think you know what I mean when I say people are rational. But the reality is you don't know what I mean until I have defined the word rational, right? In order to understand the statement people are rational, you have to know, well, what is the definition of rational? So in this sense, what I mean when I say that people are rational is that people try to take into account the information around them and do the best they can with it, right? Now, there's a lot of room for people to make mistakes there and appear what some people would describe as irrational. For example, it might be that someone doesn't have all of the relevant information. So when people try to take into account the information around them, they might just not have all of the relevant information necessary to make a decision that actually makes sense to an outsider. Now, in addition to people having incomplete information, they might have inaccurate information, right? Now, if by some miracle occurs where you have all of the relevant information and it's completely accurate, you might just botch the analysis. None of this means you're irrational. When I say people are irrational, I just mean that people try to take into account the information, whatever that is, and do the best they can with it. Now, number 2 here is that people respond to incentives. And by incentives, mostly what I'm talking about here are costs and benefits. Costs and benefits. Okay. So people will respond to the costs and benefits before them and change their behavior accordingly. Generally speaking, people want more benefit and less cost. This seems pretty obvious, but actually explains some strange things. Here's just to give you an idea of the power of incentives. You can actually incentivize people to do the most personal things in their life, like, for example, have children. Most countries, developed countries, I should say, in the world, have a population that is falling. There are several reasons why policymakers have an interest in a rising population. You can imagine a country like the United States with a high debt. If the population is falling, that debt burden is spread over fewer and fewer people, thus driving the debt per citizen or per taxpayer up. If we have a growing population, we can drive those debt per citizen or per taxpayer figures down. And that's desirable, right? People don't want to be burdened with debt from prior generations. So anyway, we want a growing population. Most developed countries have a falling population, and some have tried to implement policies to do something about that. Estonia is an example of one such country. They implemented a cash payment scheme to mothers of newly born children for the first 15 months after they are born. And you might think, gosh, can 15 months worth of promised cash actually increase birth rates? Well, it can, and it did. Birth rates went from 1.3 to 1.5. Now you might wonder, what is that 1.3, 1.5? That is the average expected births per woman. Now, in order for the population to remain stable, that number needs to be about 2.1 to replace a man and a woman and account for some premature mortality. Now, going from 1.3 to 1.5 didn't solve Estonia's problem. It didn't bring them up to a population replacement level, but it is nonetheless tens of thousands of people that exist only because the government promised their mom cash for 15 months after they're born. Incredible, right? Well, that speaks to the power of economic incentives. I could give you lots of examples of those, but I'll try to keep it brief where I can. Now, number 3 here, optimal decisions are made on the margin. We'll talk about each of these 3 specifically a little bit more, but when we say optimal decisions are made at the margin, another sort of interpretation of this statement, it's a bit wordy, might be the best decisions, and that's what optimal decisions mean, right? The best decisions are made at the margin. I might change this to say using what's called marginal analysis. Okay, so analysis. So marginal analysis is basically analysis that just involves weighing the marginal or additional. That's what this word means. Additional costs and benefits of a course of action. We say that it is rational to weigh the costs and the benefits of a course of action to see if it makes sense. And that's basically what marginal analysis is. Weighing the costs and benefits of a course of action. We say it's rational to do something if and only if the benefits, the marginal benefits, are at least as large as the marginal cost. So we'll talk more about that and why we have this word marginal at the front of those statements there. But anyway, let's start with this, right? People are rational. I mentioned this. People try to take into account the information and do the best they can with it. It doesn't mean that they always make the right decisions. It just means that people try to use the information they have. Now, people respond to incentives. This explains a lot of random things that I mentioned. Americans have become increasingly obese, as you may be aware of. It has significant health problems. Why has this happened? Well, fast food is cheap compared to healthy food. That didn't used to be the case. Also, it's a lot easier to entertain yourself without being active now, right? The internet is pretty incredible for that. And of course, more people have insurance now than they have in the past. And having insurance may very well create more obesity because, look, obesity causes health problems, and health problems are expensive. If people have insurance, then they don't really have to pay for the costs of their decision to be obese. Everyone else in society pays it, who pays into the healthcare system. So having health insurance may actually make people more obese. So think about that for a minute, right? That speaks to the power of economic incentives. So anyway, finally, optimal decisions are made on the margin, all right? Now, marginal in economics just means additional. If you look it up in the dictionary, you'll see it's like the fourth definition of that word marginal is additional, all right? The reason why marginal analysis is important is because the vast majority of decisions in life are not all or nothing. It's pretty much always a little more or a little less. And how much are you willing to pay for a little more? Is it worth it? That kind of thing. I mean, listen, when I try to buy milk at the grocery store, I am perplexed. The pricing that they have is really good. Go in there and try to buy a half gallon of milk and watch how easy it is to talk yourself into buying 2 gallons of milk. Right? You will see why I walk out of there with 2 gallons of milk and chugging milk for weeks afterwards. Anyway, so in order to figure out these all or nothing decisions, you got to figure out, these marginal decisions where it's a little more or a little less. You have to weigh the additional amount you would get, the marginal benefit, against the additional amount you would pay, the marginal cost, to see if it makes sense. Here, let me give you an example. All right, I was at the grocery store the other day, and I went to the deli counter to buy a sandwich. And I do this a lot. I like their sandwiches, and sometimes I'll buy a soda. Right. So the other day I decided I would buy a soda, and I was faced with choosing between these two different quantities here. Now, I'm not very artistic, so you should appreciate the beauty of these sodas I've just drawn here. Right, this is a 16-ounce soda, and the price was $1.49. All right, and here we have a 24-ounce soda. These are from the soda fountain. The price was $1.89. Now, given that I knew I was going to buy a soda, I was deciding between these two sizes, right? And in order to make the decision, I should be doing marginal analysis, all right? So essentially what that means is looking at the additional benefit and weighing that against the additional cost to see if it makes sense to buy the bigger or the smaller size. So say, for example, in this case, I'm thinking of buying the 24-ounce soda instead of the 16-ounce soda. Let's walk through what the marginal benefit and the marginal cost are, right? I would get, if I buy the bigger soda, the marginal benefit is 8 additional ounces, right? Going from 16 to 24. And I would mention also that those are ounces 17 through 24, the last 8 ounces. I'm mentioning that because the last 8 ounces of soda are not as satisfying as the first 8 ounces of soda. For one thing, you're not as thirsty anymore. And if we're talking about soda fountains, let's be real here. The ice can melt and water down the soda. That's not good. And also, it'll lose its carbonation after a while. So what you're getting here by buying the bigger soda are the last 8 ounces, not the first 8 ounces, right? So what we want to know is it worth buying those last 8 ounces for the additional cost that you would have to pay, right? The marginal benefit of buying the bigger one is 8 additional ounces. The marginal cost is 40 additional cents. So the proper way to make this decision, and I realize it's kind of a grandiose statement, but the proper way to make this decision is as follows. Are the additional 8 ounces worth the additional 40 cents? There's not a right answer to that question because it's subjective. You as the buyer get to decide, but this is the right way to make the decision, right? Do the marginal analysis. Are those last 8 ounces worth those last 40 cents? All right, So that's marginal analysis. You can apply that to a lot of different situations. And I would point out to you here, look, economics is the study of how we should make decisions, essentially, in a world of scarce resources, which is the one we live on. And decisions are difficult to make. A lot of times in life, it can be hard to even figure out how to go about making a decision if the problem is particularly complex. And I suggest to you that you could fall back on marginal analysis. It's a really useful framework that can be applied to a lot of different decisions. I've made relationship decisions using marginal analysis, career decisions, decisions about how far I want to continue my education, all kinds of different decisions you can make in life using marginal analysis. So if you're ever perplexed by a decision, just fall back on this. This is a beautiful, hyper-rational crutch that will help you make decisions that will make your life better. So I hope you will use marginal analysis. You will certainly have to do it to be successful in this class, but I hope that it's a skill you'll take beyond this class as well. All right? All right. So listen, every society has to deal with scarcity, unfortunately. It is nature of the human condition that we have unlimited wants and we're stuck here on planet Earth that has limited resources, right? Now, because of scarcity, we have to make trade-offs. Basically, we're going to use all of the resources we have, right? Because we have unlimited wants and we have limited resources. At least that's a reasonable assumption to make. All of our resources are going to be used for something, even if it's a tree sitting on the side of a hill looking beautiful. That is still an allocation of the resource, right? So, every decision we make about how to use the resources we have involves trade-offs. In that, if we decide to produce more of one good or service, it means we have to give up some of another good or service, right? All of the resources are going to be accounted for. So using more of a resource towards doing one thing means giving up the ability to do something else. This is the nature of a trade-off. We face these all the time. Anyone making decisions under scarcity has to make trade-offs. Every day we have limited time and money, and we have to decide what to do with our time and our money. When we use our time and our money to do one thing, we give up the ability to use it for others, and that's the nature of a trade-off. Now, most of the time, there are a lot of trade-offs made when we, in fact, do make a resource allocation decision. For example, you're sitting here watching this video, right? There's a lot of other things that you could be doing, but this is your number one alternative. I can tell because you're actually sitting here listening to me, right? A lot of other things that you could do. All of those other things that you have given up in order to watch this video, those are all trade-offs. Now, probably you couldn't do all of those things at the same time. You're not actually giving up doing all of those different options. You're probably giving up just one of those options right now. And the highest valued alternative that you give up is called your opportunity cost. This is what you would actually be doing if you weren't giving up the opportunity and pursuing your current course of action instead, right? So if you wanted to make a list of all the things you could be doing instead of watching this video, your opportunity cost would be the highest valued of all of those other alternatives. All right, so we'll come back to the idea of opportunity cost various points in this course. Now, I would point out to you that everyone has to deal with scarcity. Even rich people have to deal with scarcity. If they do something with some of their oodles of cash, then it gives up their ability, costs them their ability to do something else with it. So everyone has to deal with scarcity. And I would highlight also that it is the entire motivation for the study of resource allocation. If we didn't have scarcity, you wouldn't have to study how to use the resources we have because we would have enough resources. All right? So that's good. So every society has to deal with scarcity, and it forces every society to answer three fundamental questions, all right? We have to decide with the resources we have, what goods and services will be produced, how will they be produced, and once they are produced, who gets them? Friends, these are the fundamental decisions that every society has to deal with, right? They have resources that are available. They have people who want the goods and services that are produced with those resources, and so they have to figure out exactly what goods and services will be produced. Producing more of one thing involves giving up another, right? So we got to figure out what will be produced, and then, of course, how will the goods and services be produced? Now, most of the time, a firm or government or whoever's making the good itself will have different production methods available. How will the goods and services be produced is an important decision. And then finally, once the goods and services are produced, who gets them? This is, a pretty critical decision, actually. At least as important as the other two. What will be produced and how will it be produced, right? And in some societies, things are distributed evenly. In our society, most things are distributed according to who can pay for them. But not all, right? Some goods and services are distributed based on other factors. For example, education up through 12th grade, everybody gets that. Healthcare for people over age 65, everybody gets that in our society, right? In some societies, they are more generous with the stuff that everybody gets. In some societies, they are less generous. And we'll see that there are lots of trade-offs involved. In order to provide, for example, healthcare for everybody, which is a possibility, we would have to tax other people more in order to provide those benefits. And so maybe this will happen for us. Maybe by the time you watch this video that will have happened, although I think it's unlikely. We'll see. So in any case, every society has to figure out, with the resources we have, what are we going to do with them? Specifically, first question, what will be produced? Second question, how will it be produced? Third question, once it's produced, who gets it? Now, if you look around the world, you can see societies have answered these three questions in some different ways. Now, the primary thing that distinguishes how one society has answered these questions relative to another society is how much control does the government have? Now, some societies, the government has basically taken over total control of the process. The government asserts ownership over the resources and then decides how the resources will be used. This is a centrally planned economy, most commonly associated with socialist or communist countries, right? Now, the other end of the extreme, away from have the government do everything, is have the government do as little as possible. And that's what a market economy is. In a market economy, individuals own the resources, and then they trade those resources with each other in markets. Now, those individuals could be represented by the firms that they create or the households that they head, but nonetheless, you have individuals owning resources and trading them with each other in markets. Now, the reality is that no country has a purely centrally planned economy or a pure market economy. They just don't work. They're not practical. For example, government cannot control everything that, every economic decision. Also, markets cannot exist without some government. You have to have a government that, at a minimum, enforces the rule of law, enforces property rights, and enforces contracts. Without those things, you can't really have a market economy. So the reality is that no country does, a pure centrally planned or a pure market economy these days. Every country has a mixed economy where the government decides how some of the resources are going to be used, and individuals acting in markets determine how the rest of the resources are going to be used. The big distinction between countries is how much control over this process does the government have. Now, I will throw a word in here for centrally planned economies. I like the idea of a centrally planned economy. Look, the consequences of these three fundamental questions, what will be produced, how will it be produced, and who gets it, are massive, right? The answers to these questions determine the quality of life within a country, and the way a society sets up its economy is essentially its answer to those three fundamental questions. These questions are really important. It's good to have a plan in place to support a goal that you have. Right? The goal should be making people as happy as possible based on the resources that are available. So in order to achieve that goal, it makes sense that you would want to have a plan in place. And that's what a centrally planned economy does. The government takes stock of the resources that are available and then tries to figure out what the people want, and then puts a plan in place for using the resources in order to produce what people want. That all sounds pretty good, actually. Typically, after the stuff is produced, it is distributed in a relatively even way, and some people think that that's what fair is, right? So centrally planned economy has some things going for it. It has some really unintended consequences, though. One is that because the things that are produced are relatively equally distributed, there's not a whole lot of motivation for individuals in those societies to be creative and come up with new ideas, right? You can't really get rich off of your idea in that type of society because it becomes the people's idea, and it gets distributed to people evenly. So the lack of the motivation or the ability to get rich really restricts the creativity in these countries. There are communist countries throughout the world, and you don't see a whole lot in the way of really groundbreaking, creative stuff coming out of those societies. Now, there are some exceptions, of course, but by and large, capitalism, which is sort of the alternative here, market economy, rewards creativity and allows people to get rich. Now, the genius of capitalism is that you can't get rich unless you create value for other people, right? That's the whole deal. You got to think about that for a minute, right? In a centrally planned economy with no incentive to get rich, people aren't going to put their brilliant ideas into practice in a way that can benefit others, at least not as frequently. Now, so that's one big drawback of a centrally planned economy is the restriction on creativity just based on the incentives in place. But the other big one is that, and this is a big one, listen, if you're not on board with the plan, then you're viewed as a threat to the plan, and you might have to be dealt with. It's not necessarily a fair process either. Should do some research on that. How are people in centrally planned economies who don't agree with the plan handled? Right? Well, it's not a gentle process, I can tell you that. Anyway, so I did want to throw a few things out there about centrally planned economies. You'll hear most economists say we prefer a market economy, and we'll talk about why here in a minute. The reality is that every society today has a mixed economy where the government controls a portion and markets control the rest. In the United States, it really depends on what you count, but we say between probably about 25 to 45% of the economy, or 20 to 40, or somewhere in there, just depending on what you count, is determined by the government. All right. Now, you might be surprised to know that some of our biggest sort of adversaries, like China these days, their economy, we don't have a great faith in the economic data that come out of China, but we think their economy is controlled maybe around 60-65% by the government. So if the United States is around 40 and China is around 60, it's just not that big of a difference, is the point I'm making. Some of our closest allies, like Sweden, for example, they are closer to China than they are the United States. I know there's some other key distinctions between these societies here, but generally speaking, my point is that these societies that seem to be rivals might in fact be closer together than you might think. Every society has a mixed economy today where the government decides how some resources are allocated, provides some goods for the people, but maybe not all of them. And the big debate is about between countries is about how much control should the government have. And you should think about this for a minute in the scope of world history post-World War II era. After World War II, the Soviet Union emerged as a superpower, communism, and the United States emerged as the capitalist superpower. At the end of World War II, the United States was producing about 50% of all the goods and services in the world, which is a tremendous number. All right. Now, we did have this kind of showdown between Soviet Union and the United States called the Cold War. And we fought several wars within the scope of the Cold War. We went to Korea and fought a war in Korea. Then we had the Vietnam War. Both of these were part of our policy of containment. Right? What were we trying to contain? Well, communism, which is to say centrally planned economies. Right? I mean, the whole Cold War was about this issue, how much control over the economies the government can have. We went to multiple wars fighting these battles. Even today in our country, this is probably the single biggest thing that separates us politically between conservatives and liberals. Generally speaking, liberals think the government should have a bigger role and provide more programs and things for people, and conservatives think that the government should have a smaller role and a limited role and stay out of people's lives. So this is, a really big defining issue in our time and in recent global history. So how much control should the government have? That is something you get to think about. And, you're probably not going to come to a consensus on it. And even if you do, it might change over the course of your lifespan. Generally speaking, these things change with how much money people have. And as you grow older, you'll probably have more money, which tends to make people think the government should provide fewer services. Because, of course, in order to provide services, the government has to tax people, and they tax the rich more than the poor. So rich people are generally less likely to favor government programs. Of course, this is a generalization, and you can find lots of rich people that are very liberal, and you can find poor people that are conservative. But anyway, my point is, even if you do think you figure out what the appropriate role for government is in the economy, that might change over time. That's all I'm saying. All right? So, when we look at these different types of economies, a reasonable question to ask is, well, what type of economy do we want, right? What do we want our economy to look like? And basically, we want our economy to be good. Okay, what the heck does that mean, and how could you assess that, right? Well, I would suggest that to figure out what type of an economy we want, you should go back to the three fundamental questions that every society has to face, right? And the reason we go back to those questions is because the way a society sets up its economy is its answer to those three questions. You'll recall those three questions are: what goods and services will be produced? How will those goods and services be produced? And once they are produced, who gets them? Right? We want good answers to these questions. Okay? So what the heck does that mean? All right. So let's go back to that first question. What will be produced? If you had two countries that were side by side, and one produced a certain sort of bundle of goods and services, and another produced some other bundle of goods and services, how could you say that one country's production bundle is better than the other country's production bundle? Right? It's a good question. How could you distinguish and say, well, this country, they did a better job at picking what should be produced than this other country over here? Right? Well, I would suggest to you, you should think about that for a minute, maybe pause the video if you want, but I would suggest to you that the primary determining factor about what makes the bundle of goods and services a good one for a society to produce is that that bundle of goods and services should match up with consumer preferences, right? It should be what people want, not a bunch of crap that people don't want. I mean, that sounds like a basic statement, but basically that's it, right? What goods and services can be produced, we want it to be the right stuff, the stuff that people actually want. And that's what allocative efficiency is about. We want to produce things in accordance with consumer preferences, right? And so what that means is produce as long as, the benefit to the consumer is greater than or equal to the cost of the production, right? And because marginal costs tend to rise, we'll talk about why that is later, and marginal benefit of consuming tends to fall, usually we want it so that the last unit has equal marginal benefit to marginal cost. But we'll talk about that later. So, in terms of the first fundamental question, what will be produced? We want allocative efficiency. We want the stuff that's produced to match up with what people want. Now, the second question is, how will the goods and services be produced? Right? So imagine you figured out what you want to produce, and now you have these different production methods you might employ in order to produce those goods and services, right? Well, if you have multiple ways that you could produce a good, typically what you want is to produce things at the lowest possible cost. Remember, in the big picture, the problem we have is scarcity. The resources we have will not provide everything that we want because we have unlimited wants, right? So what that means is that when we produce a resource, when we produce a good or service, we want to use the minimum amount of resources, because if we can use the minimum amount of resources to produce a particular thing, that conserves the most of our limited resources in order to produce all of the other stuff that people want, right? So when we say we want to produce things at the lowest possible cost, that's desirable because the amount of cost reflects the amount of resources required to produce something. If we produce at the lowest possible cost, we are using the minimum amount of resources, which maximizes the amount of the other stuff we're able to produce. Producing at the lowest possible cost is called productive efficiency. Okay, so productive efficiency is related to fundamental question 2, how will things be produced? Allocative efficiency is related to fundamental question number 1, what will be produced? Well, we want it to be the right stuff. All right. Now remember that the third fundamental question is once the goods and services are produced, who gets them, right? And there's definitely some debate about that. The issue of who gets the goods and services, well, there are different ways to allocate the goods and services. I think what we can agree is that they should be distributed in a fair way, and that's what equity is, the fair distribution of economic benefits. The problem is that this term fair is very subjective. Some people think fair means that everything should be distributed equally, and there's certainly a case to be made for that, right? The biggest determining factor on our life outcomes is the family that we are born into. Something that none of us has any control over, all right? And so if the circumstances of our birth determine most of the outcomes in life, and that's something none of us can control, shouldn't we all just have an equal cut at the resources that are here? That seems reasonable. But another reasonable argument is that, well, if one person is lazy or one person works harder than another, that person should get more. That's definitely another approach to it, right? So my point here is that how things are distributed, the fairness is totally subjective, and it's not something that you're going to get to the bottom of, and your view on that might change over the course of your life. Now, one of the themes we'll see in this class is that when governments implement policies, there are always trade-offs, and a lot of times we give up some efficiency in order to get what we perceive as more equity. Now, in general, economists think that as far as efficiency goes, market economies are more likely to reach efficiency. Okay, and the reasons are a few. One, in a market economy, allocative efficiency is reached because consumers and households are actually interacting with firms in markets to determine how things are going to be produced. All right, we go to the markets every day and we communicate with the firms about what our interests are and what we want. We make that communication by voting with our dollars. Right? I've walked into many stores and walked out having purchased nothing because I said, "You have nothing for me." Right? So look, I bring this issue up here because we kind of have to choose between what type of economy we want, right? We can figure out what type of economy we want based on based on the government policies that we implement. We can create the playing field that we want, okay? Now, we have some possibilities here. We've got a centrally planned economy where the government controls basically everything, market economy where the government controls as little as possible, and we have a mixed economy here, right? Now, what I'd like to do is go through these 3 desirable characteristics of an economy, right? We want productive efficiency, allocative efficiency, and we want equity, right? Let's think for a minute about, what type of economy is likely to yield those positive outcomes for us, okay? Now, I would encourage you to think about the options here between these types of economies as options that exist on a spectrum, okay? On the spectrum, you have something like the percent of economy controlled by government. Sorry, my handwriting is terrible. We've been over that. All right, you have 0% down here. This is kind of where a market economy is, or theoretically, you want as little control over the economy by the government as possible with the pure market economy. Over here, you've got the centrally planned economy where they try to control everything. The reality is that every economy today is somewhere here in the middle, in the mixed economy range, right? From 1% to 99%, you got a mixed economy there. Now, whenever you have a range of possible outcomes like this one, a really useful analytical technique is to consider the extremes. Not because you want one of the extremes, or even in this case, the extremes might not even be possible, right? But because it's a useful way to think about what direction you might want things to go in order to achieve the different, goals you might have. Like, for example, we want allocative efficiency. And that's the situation where the stuff that's produced match up with what people want. Now, in a centrally planned economy, down here at the 100% side, you've the decisions about what are produced is made by the government, essentially. The government decides what goods and services will be produced. In a market economy, the consumers are actually involved in the decision-making process because they are interacting with the firms in markets, telling them what they want. For that reason, most economists think a market economy is more likely to reach allocative efficiency. Also, the firms are competing with each other, trying to get our dollars. They're only going to get our dollars if they have the right stuff, right? So a market economy where there's lots of competition is very helpful in getting us allocative efficiency. Now, that competition is also really helpful with productive efficiency. Remember, productive efficiency is producing stuff at the lowest possible cost. And when you have firms competing with each other over profits, the cost of production is something they care a lot about because that help maximizes their profits, right? Profit is the difference between revenue and cost. And so maximizing profits, which is the objective of every firm, is, or basically every firm, is achieved when you minimize costs, right? So cost minimization, productive efficiency is more likely to be met in a market economy where you have firms competing with each other than a centrally planned economy where you just have the government deciding how things will be produced. Now, certainly the government wants to produce things at the lowest possible cost and wants to produce the things that people want. But because of the incentives that are in place in a market system, and we know people respond to incentives, we think that a market economy is most likely to reach efficiency, which is why you will hear economists for the rest of your life probably basically say, yay, markets. Economists generally like markets because they reach these efficient outcomes at a higher rate. Now, the third thing that we want is equity, the fair distribution of benefits. Now, fairness is subjective, so economists haven't really come to a consensus on that. But basically, if you think that things should be split up evenly, then probably more government control is what you want. If you think things should be split up according to who can pay for them, then you want a market economy, and that's a more fair way to distribute goods and services. Personally, I would prefer it if they were distributed based on hard work, and that says income is probably a better way to determine how goods and services are produced, but at the same time, so many people work really hard, really, really hard, and they don't make any income to show for it. So, hard work, income as a proxy for hard work is not particularly reliable. I realize that. So anyway, that's the nature of the beast, friends. We want efficiency, we want equity. A lot of times there are trade-offs between those. Now we're going to consider those issues and a lot of others in this class. And generally speaking, we're going to be doing two types of analysis, positive and normative. All right. Positive analysis is analysis concerned with what is. In other words, is something taking place? Normative analysis is concerned with what ought to be or with what should be. So is the world the way it should be? Should we implement a policy in order to achieve some desirable outcome? That kind of thing. So positive analysis is a lot easier to do. And for that's one of the main reasons that economists perform mostly positive analysis, because we just get to a straight answer about whether or not something is taking place. Normative analysis and normative statements are harder to interpret and judge because they're based on how things should be, and that's very, very subjective, right? So positive analysis is objective and fact-based. Normative analysis is subjective and opinion-based. And there are positive and normative statements that you need to be able to distinguish between as well. Basically, if the statement has the word should in it or ought to be or whatever, it's normative. Positive statements are more fact-based. Like, for example, I could say, it's 65 degrees outside. Well, that's an objective statement. It's true or it's not, and you could figure out the answer by observing a thermometer. If you could figure out the answer to a question or the validity of a statement by observation, then it's positive analysis. So if I say it's 65 degrees outside, we could go out there and figure that out pretty quickly, right? So that's positive analysis. Now, if I said it's cold outside, that is a whole different deal, right? We can argue about whether or not it's cold. Someone from Alaska might think it's not cold, and someone from Florida might think it is cold. These are reasonable people. Whether or not it's cold is subjective. And so it is not objective. And because it's subjective, that makes it normative, right? There are positive and normative analytical issues associated with a lot of things. Think about taxing cigarettes, for example, right? One thing we might want to know is, does taxing cigarettes reduce smoking? And the answer is yes. We've done that analysis and we figured it out. Now, here's another issue, though. Generally speaking, it's basically, if you look at the data, it's basically poor people who smoke. People with less education and less income, and those two things basically always go hand in hand, tend to smoke more. So if you do tax cigarettes, you're taxing poor people. Should we do that? Well, that is a normative question. It's concerned with what ought to be. Should we tax cigarettes? Well, that's debatable. I lean towards yes, we should, because healthcare costs are spread out over society, and when one person smokes cigarettes, the cost of their decision, if they get cancer anyway, is spread out over everyone. If people aren't paying for the cost of their decisions, I'm not happy. So anyway, that's why I think we should tax cigarettes. But anyway, positive and normative analysis is something we'll do a fair amount in this course, and I'll point it out to you, although mostly our work will be positive, and we'll have debates about normative issues because people get more involved with those debates. You'll see those in our course. Anyway, I guess one last thing to say between, in economics, probably the biggest distinction, although there are a lot of different subfields, is between micro and macro. Microeconomics, you probably hear this word micro at the front, and that means like you might use a microscope. What do you use a microscope on? Small stuff. So microeconomics, we study small elements of our economy, like an individual household or an individual firm, and how they act or should act. Macro is the opposite of micro. The macro view is the big view. We look at the economy overall. And so in macroeconomics, we study things like how the overall economy is doing with regard to production, measured with GDP. We measure the overall extent of joblessness with the unemployment rate in macroeconomics. In microeconomics, we might focus on individual markets instead of the economy, which is the sum of all markets. We might study individual households or individual firms and how they can maximize their happiness given their situation. Anyway, so that's the distinction between macro and micro. And that, friends, is the end of our first chapter. So thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the worksheet video. A Kearns production. All rights reserved.